Say, for example, you have access to a cool, old, vintage bike. Maybe it's a cool, old mountain bike. Maybe it's not at all. Maybe it's just an old hybrid. It doesn't matter. Who cares? Biggest thing is, you want to bring it out of its neglected life that it is currently experiencing and get it back to a road-going or trail-going machine. Now, if you follow this channel at all, or perhaps the builds that sometimes come out of this channel, you'd be forgiven for assuming and thinking that the process of taking any retro or vintage bike, mountain bike, or anything of the like back from a neglected state to a rideable state is a wildly involved endeavor. One that, on this channel, tends to deem all bikes a drop bar candidate no matter what the origins. And that could not be further from the truth. Drop bars, well, they tend to just be my personal preference. You could really go either direction with any resurrection, restoration, upgrade escapade. Actually, as a matter of fact, you might not even need to change any parts whatsoever to resurrect an old vintage bike from where it's been sitting for so long. Sometimes you just need to check everything over and get it kind of moving again. So here are the places I think you should start by looking and checking and get moving again before you really start with all of the upgrades and get to a point like this. Check all of the rotating and moving parts to make sure that nothing is rough, gritty, loose, too tight, or overall feeling like it's on the brink of self-destruction. That is, wheels and hubs with no discernible play. Hopefully the rim runs fairly true and doesn't rub on the brakes. Headset should not clunk and should move freely without feeling like it's made of sandpaper. The bottom bracket where the crank is should have no clunking back and forth. If you grab the crank like this and rock it back and forth, it should spin freely. It also should not feel like it's made out of sandpaper and rocks. The biggest culprit for poor performance is going to be shifting and drivetrain. So to try and contest and maybe troubleshoot some issues that you might have, check the cables to see if there's any rust on them or if they're corroded or anything. A good spot to check is going into cable housings and all along where it's running. If there is rust on the cables, especially going into the housing, there's a very good chance that there's a bunch of friction being introduced to what is supposed to be a very slick moving mechanism. One obviously really easy way to diagnose a poorly shifting bike is just to try shifting through it. The neck method might not be for everybody, but it does give you a spot to pedal through and shift through some of the gears to see if it's working the way it's supposed to. But one really common thing to happen on older bikes is that either the shifter gets damaged at some point, the ratcheting mechanism doesn't really want to release and come back, the shifter actually won't drop back down or hold where it needs to be. There'll be rust on the cable, introducing a lot of friction into the system, not allowing it to want to shift back down after the cable tension is released on the shifter, or the rear derailleur will just be so gunked up in all the pivot points that it can't really be brought back to life. All three of these things can definitely happen to older bikes that have been sitting around for a little while, but my number one choice is always to look at cables first, because they're going to be your cheapest and easiest option, and they are very, very instrumental to making sure that everything works properly, and they should be very clean. From there, look at the shifter. If the shifter is wrecked, or if it's not shifting the way it should, if it's not clicking up, bringing the derailleur up to the larger cogs, or it's releasing in a weird way that maybe shoots the derailleur all the way back down to the smallest cog, likely that needs to be replaced. And then a good way to find out if the derailleur is working well or not is just to test it by isolating it away from the shifter and pushing it up the cogs by hand as you spin the cranks. If while pushing it up to the largest cog and releasing the pressure from your hand doesn't allow it to come back down, you have probably got an old, clapped out, poorly stored, bad rear derailleur that should just be replaced with something new. But before you feel you need those things, always check the cables first. the cables can make or break your shifting system. As a matter of fact, a good rule of thumb when resurrecting a bike is if the shifters are working pretty good and the derailleur seems to also be working pretty good, do cables anyway. It'll appreciate it. Now for the actual mechanical portions of the drivetrain itself, that is chain, cassette, and chain rings, if it's shifting okay, if it's pedaling okay, if it's not skipping, and it doesn't feel like it's gonna break, and it's not full of rust, and it's maybe not covered in actual grease, just ride it. Ride it until you save up enough to just replace it with like parts. 7-speed and 8-speed stuff is crazy, crazy cheap. But for the time being, with your resurrection goals ahead of you, if it's pedaling and it's shifting and it's not skipping, ride it. The next thing to look at is the brakes, more specifically the brake pads. And again, as a good rule of thumb, just replace the brake pads anyway. They'll dry rot, they'll get kind of gross, they'll become rock hard, and they will not do what they need to do. It's supposed to be a nice kind of soft rubbery compound that are gonna like grab onto a rim, not stick against it like a brick on like a piece of ice. So new brake pads, always a good idea, just like throwing new cables on a bike that's been sitting for a while. Now actually this bike here, which is my friend Jeff's, is a pretty prime example of an older bike with really bad. These are all worn down and rock hard from kind of being outside a lot. They're also the post mount style. So they're actually harder and more annoying to adjust. The adjustment is fairly infinite, and I'll be honest, being a new school mechanic, when it comes to these old school like post style brake pad cantilever brakes, it is not my strong suit. And I tend to just, if the opportunity presents itself, turf them and get rid of them completely, which is literally what I'm about to do right now. Thankfully, the really nice part of working with like older stuff is none of it is super high end, and you can usually get a hold of replacement parts for not a lot of money. And when you go to pull your brake, if it goes in and doesn't want to release when you let go, there's a good chance you've got a seized brake with bad springs that don't want to spring back anymore, and you just might find yourself wanting to do the same. Not trying to influence your decision one way or the other, but modern brakes work so much nicer and feel far superior over old school cantilever brakes, especially old school ones that have been on a bike for 25 to 30 years. Next thing to really tie the Resurrection fully together is tires. Now in my mind, for riding it at first, to make sure that you like it and that it's gonna fit and everything is right about it, riding whatever on it is fine. And if they're not totally dry rotted and feel like dry, scaly skin, use them. Burn them completely out and then pick something cool that you like the look of that is like a slightly nicer quality tire than maybe what was on there before. Kind of like what's on the Rockhopper now. But don't waste the tires that are already on there. Wreck them, enjoy them, get something you like. If that's all in order, you're pretty much good to go. You could probably ride the bike that you've just gone over for the next 30 years, as long as it doesn't live in a snowbank every winter. Okay, that's it. That's how I would go about just resurrecting a retro vintage bike that has not seen the road in quite some time, without just completely jumping into the deep end and spending the money that like I did with this, that I made Jeff spend on this, or creating what we did with the dirt cheap gravel bike, the Norco Rideau. One thing I will say is that bikes are pretty resilient machines. I've listed a lot of stuff here that it's like, yeah, it'd be nice to change this. It'd be nice to do this. It'd be nice to kind of customize this. It'd be nice to change this out. But pretty rare that anything you find is really going to need all of that stuff right away to tool around on and ride. This type of thing, this is the type of thing that you can like ride the bike for a little bit, tolerate its quirks, tolerate the annoyances that it is, and then just when it gets bad enough or when the money flows in, you buy that shifter or you buy that cassette and chain, and then you feel how much better the bike feels in those incremental steps. And then if you feel you want to go further with that project, if you feel that that's a bike that you're like, hell yeah, I want to keep this going and I want to do more to it. The next thing you know, you start doing stuff like we did with this, what we call the Grouch Rock Hopper, this retro drop bar, modern parts build, and then you make videos about it on YouTube. If I missed anything, I already know you're going to throw it in the comments below, but don't hesitate to do that, and we'll all just have a great conversation down there.